So I'm guessing you're here because your 1980s BMW is not starting. Well, today I'm going to show you guys how I tackle a crank no start on my 1980 series BMWs. I'm going to go through the steps I like to use to figure out what's going on, and by the end of it, hopefully we have this 635 running, and hopefully you guys have a better idea of how to tackle a problem such as this. Yep, no spark. We should hear the fuel pump. Totally messed up sensor. So our patient today is a 1985 635 CSI. I picked this car up last week and I had to drag it, and I mean drag it, out of this guy's driveway. This car has been sitting since 2012. It has just been in a driveway under a cover. The tires were melted into the pavement. It was quite a sight to behold. Winched it up on the trailer and we got it back here. This is a Delphin Gray over Llama interior car, so it's actually a pretty nice combo. Unfortunately, it's rusty, beat up. I originally got this for parts, but I found an enthusiast, I think in Arizona, who wants to bring it back to life. So I'm gonna get it running so that we can, facilitate getting it on a trailer easier. So this video, as I said, is dedicated more so to the 80s cars. That means E24, E28. E12 is a bit of a stretch. It's a little bit older of a system. E32 and E34, very similar. A lot of these techniques I'll be using are pretty close between a lot of the 80s to 90s BMWs. However, of course, this is gonna be particular to a 635, but there's a lot of similarities. E30 also applies here. So this 635 will crank all day long, but it won't start. Now, if your car doesn't crank, there's an engineering acronym, KISS. Keep it simple, stupid. I get a lot of questions every day. Why, my car won't start, or I see threads and people say my car won't start, it won't crank, and they immediately run to the most obscure, crazy things. So this is an 80s BMW. There's no EWS, there's no immobilizer system, right? So if your car doesn't crank, and I have the old school Bosch troubleshooting guides, I'm pretty sure off memory, 85% of the time, it's a dead battery. Seriously, it is almost always a dead battery. Your car doesn't crank, charge your battery. If you think the battery is really old, replace the battery. The battery in this car is like a year old. He just replaced it. I don't know why he replaced it if the car was sitting, but either way, I got the jump box on it to ensure that we have strong cranking. If it has a weak crank, charge it or replace it, because this car will not start with a really slow, weak crank. These things need a quick crank to get it started. Now, if it's not your battery, then the next thing is check out the wiring. Look at the wiring. Is it missing a ground? Is there, for some reason, the power cable not hooked up? Whatever reason like that. Otherwise, then you go over to the starter. If the starter's not spinning, it's just clicking, but you have a good battery, because a lot of people will jump into a starter replacement without even realizing their battery's bad. If you know it's not the battery, then head over to your starter. And if you're confident that it's not working, you could take a screwdriver or a jumper wire and you could jumper your starter. There's ways, if you could look that up on the internet, you basically connect the signal to the power, make sure the car's in neutral or park, do not run yourself over. But if you do that and you get nothing, probably a dead starter, your next step would be take a hammer and a socket or an extension and smack on your starter. A lot of times you could free them up, not always, but I've had more that I could free up with a hammer than those that I couldn't. So that's my quick little no crank troubleshooting guide. There's a lot more that could go into it, bad wiring, whatever, fusible links, but for now we're sticking to it cranks, but it doesn't start. All right, we have two idiot checks. So a car that's been sitting for a long time, before you even bother attempting to get it running and driving, you need to know if you're gonna destroy the car doing so. So first things first, check your oil. You wanna make sure the car has oil. This doesn't matter if the car was sitting for a long time or if it wasn't. No point in trying to start an engine if there's no oil in it. So this thing right here, a little below half, but within limits, so we are good to go. Now, if we were to drive this car, we'd probably top it off. If the car's been sitting for a long, long time, you should change the oil. You should always change the oil on an older car. This thing, I'm not gonna take the time to change the oil. I don't have time for that. I don't wanna dump the money into it. And we're not driving it because it has a bad trans. If I was gonna be driving it, beating it up, then sure. And the second thing is fuel. So people will love to say bad fuel, your car won't start because bad fuel. Well, I've started cars with really old fuel. I mean, it's not great, but if you're in a pinch, you can do it. So this car sat for 12 years, and it was, I think, on E, so I put gas in it, so it's got fresh gas. These 80s BMWs, for the most part, have a drain plug on the fuel tank, and it's an Allen head. You could pull it out, and you could actually drain the tank, so that you can get all the old crap out of there. It's the easiest way to do it. The 635 actually does not have a drain plug on it. So if it's a full tank of really old gas, you're gonna have to figure out a way to fix that. I thought this did, but I guess it doesn't. I know E34s do, I think E30s do. So that's interesting. But either way, regardless, what you wanna do is just do a sniffer test, just smell, right? So you get in here, and if it smells like gasoline, and you know what gasoline should smell like, then it's probably fine to start. If you open up your gas tank and it reeks of this just really varnished, stinky whatever, that's not gas anymore. Do not even try to start the car. Because, I mean, if you have really messed up fuel, it could definitely affect the car starting, but for the most part, these older cars are they're not super sensitive to old crappy fuel. They should fire up on old stuff. If the cars are sitting for 20 years, replace it. If it's sitting for 10 years, replace it. If it's been like 2, 3, you're fine. 5, you're fine. I've started cars on really old gas, but just do a sniffer test. If it still smells like fuel, it's probably good enough to start. So we know we have good fuel in this car because I just filled up the tank. Well, I didn't fill up the tank, but I put a little bit in there. We have crank, we have oil, so that means we can actually get to the troubleshooting here. A quick little rundown of a 635 engine compartment, and again, E28 nearly identical, pretty much identical. E30 a little different, but give or take this with a grain of salt. Battery is down here in the left corner, right? Then up here is your fuse box. To the left of your fuse box is your main and your fuel pump relay. We are going to be playing with these. These are important to what we're doing. You have a power cable that comes off of the positive of your battery, and it runs straight to the starter. That needs to be there, otherwise you won't have a crank. But again, we're going past the no crank part. You have a ground from your battery that goes to your motor mount arm. That's also important. Back here, so ignore the fact that this car is a fuel pressure gauge. This is making my life easier, but you probably won't have this, so we're gonna treat this as if we don't have it. So ignore that. But right here is your 2 crank sensors. This is another very common issue on these 80s cars, your crank reference sensors. So the E24 and the M30 B34 has the 2 reference sensors in the bell housing. One is speed, one is position. I believe the position one is the one, or I think both, but I know one for sure will brick your car and not let it start. The other one, I think it might start, but it will run poorly. But we might be messing with these depending on how far we need to go. The later M30 B35, so an 88, 89, or E34, will have the front crank sensor, which isn't this. This is your plug wire thing, but basically comes up from the front and it plugs in over here. So if you're looking for a crank sensor, that's a super important thing to your car. And then you have your ignition coil right here, cap, rotor, plugs. So that is all that really these cars need to run. And remember, keep it simple. 4 things for an engine to start: fuel, spark, air, and compression. Now, when you crank over your engine, you'll know right away if it sounds like there's no compression. Imagine you have no spark plugs in the car and you crank the engine over. It's gonna sound way different. Let's assume you have good compression. Air, you never really have to worry about. I mean, do you have an air intake? Yes. I mean, unless there's something lodged in your intake that's blocking it off, that's not really something you have to worry about troubleshooting. Fuel and spark is where we're gonna be focusing today. Do we have fuel? Do we have spark? Super easy procedures to figure out. This is how I do it. Where we're gonna start, this is my favorite place to start. These 2 relays right here. You have your main relay and your fuel pump relay, or they could get switched around. But basically, you'll know because the main relay is a 5-prong and the fuel pump relay is a 4-prong, and usually fuel pump relays are the orange ones or maybe like a light blue, green. Main relays are, on the 80s cars, typically these silver ones. So main relay is here, then that means this is our fuel pump. These should just come up off the fuse box. Then you can get in there. And what we're gonna do right now, this is fuel pump relay because it's only got 4. So this is before the era of cars that have like 3 relays with the O2 or anything like that. So only really 2 to pick from. You have your 4-prong, then that's their 5-prong. Then what you're gonna do when you pull the relay out is get your trusty old jumper wire or a paper clip, whatever that's conductive, and we're gonna jump pins 30 and 87. 30 is your ground, 87 is your power. Basically what we're doing right now, we're eliminating the need of this relay. So sometimes these relays go bad. Honestly, not all that common for the relay itself to be bad, but we're gonna eliminate whatever the need for anything within the car, any other systems. We're going straight power to ground, which will jump the fuel pump relay and should in turn kick on the fuel pump. So then you will hear the fuel pump. If you do not hear the fuel pump doing this, you have a dead fuel pump or you have wiring issue throughout the car. I can't remember off the top of my head if these cars have fuel pump fuses. I believe they do. Go in your fuse box diagram and check that first. Make sure your fuse is intact. I'm pretty sure this one is. So we're gonna go ahead and jump them. The bottom of the relay will tell you the numbers of the pins. So 30 and 87. So let's set up how it would be. So it's 30, so it's these two right here. The one closest to the front of the car and then closest to the passenger side. So we're gonna stick jumper in. I have a really bad jumper wire, but, and then we should hear the fuel pump. Yep. So you can see there my gauge, maybe you can't, but we built pressure. Again, that gauge is huge cheating, but you don't need it. You already heard it. The noise up here was louder than it usually will be. It's windy outside, but you probably couldn't hear it. But the fuel pump all the way in the back of the car, you can hear it buzz on. So we know for a fact that we have a good fuel pump. So the car should be getting fuel. Okay, so since we have the fuel pump kicking on when we jump this relay, what I like to do to eliminate any ifs, ands, or buts, leave the jumper wires in and try to start the car, because that will immediately tell you if you have a spark or a further problem, or it does lie within your fuel system. We know the pump kicks on, but that doesn't mean that the relay is not bad. So with the wire jumped and the fuel pump running, go to start the car. If it starts, beautiful. Then you know that everything is good. This is your problem. Now, if it doesn't start, then that leads us to another road. And that road could mean a lot of things, but before you dive in and make any accusations, you want to go over and check the spark, because that will immediately tell you if it's a spark problem or if you have to revisit the fuel. And then when you revisit the fuel, there's a little bit more things you have to do. We'll see how far we have to go on that. But let's check spark now. We know we have fuel for the most part. Now, before we get any more complicated, let's check for spark. So the easiest way to do that in an M30, pull a plug wire, and then you could pull out your spark plug, but I like to typically have a spare on hand. They can't have the, whatever, the little cover here. It's gotta be just the threads, because the M30's got the skinny little plug wires. But you're gonna plug your spark plug in here, and then you need to ground it. So typically, valve cover will suffice. This valve cover is painted, so it might not work. You could have a partner here and you could hold it, you know, and crank. I do not like to touch these plug wires when the car is running, cranking, whatever. I've gotten shocked a million times. I don't know why, but these things are just prone to shocking me. So I'm gonna try to do it on the nut here. Let me see if I wanna set this up in a way. Okay, now being daytime, it might be hard to see. I'm gonna go ahead and get my phone in here. Okay, we're right above it. So we'll go to crank it and see if we have any spark. Now, if you've worked on enough of these cars, you can actually kind of hear when they don't have spark. I could tell right away this car didn't have spark. There's typically more of a, I don't know, it's impossible to explain, but if you're a veteran watching this, you know what I mean. You can hear when they have spark. Yep, no spark. So, and I could smell the fuel as well. When you work on enough of these, you can you get the hints before you even really do any troubleshooting. But so we know we don't have spark, but we don't have spark to the plugs. Now, I have had a situation, albeit very rare, you could have a cap or a rotor so bad that they do not allow spark to the plugs. So the next step would be to check for spark directly from the coil. So we got a protective cover on here. See if I can get this off. So to rule out it being maybe your cap or your rotor, we're gonna check straight from the ignition coil, right? So here, same deal. Plug it in, and let's give it a crank. Still no spark. So we know that it's not the cap in the rotor, it's not the plug wires. So that means now our problem is ignition coil or deeper, if you will. What you do now is basically multimeter time. You kind of need it. Now this car is messed with. We have what looks like an MSD ignition down here, and then stock harness is jumped into the positive and negative from the MSD, so they're kind of spliced. And just looking at this, I think I immediately just found our problem. This was like this under the cover, I couldn't see it, but this is the terminal with our positives, and it's broken off of the coil. But we'll go through and we'll do this anyway, just for the sake of the video. And again, your car won't have this. This is clearly a messed with car. I mean, MSD's not bad, you know, but the way they did it's interesting. But we got to ignore all the BS, and we got to get our multimeter into the actual harness itself connection. Terminal 15 on the coil, which is the positive, you have to check for 12 volts there. That should be hot. So you got to bust out your voltmeter. So I guess one special tool you need here. Terminal 15, and then just a ground. So right now we don't have any voltage there. That's because obviously it's broken off. So it's not quite 12, but it's telling me what I need to know. So we're getting 10 volts right here. I don't know if that's because of this jumper crap, but so we do have voltage at the positive of the ignition coil. So that means that the OBC is working, and all the scary things that could possibly have been issues aren't really issues. That kind of tells us, you know, things, again, everything's different sometimes, but power at the coil kind of means that all the electronics are in order. So now if you have voltage at your coil, but you think your coil is a problem, I always have spares. I like to just throw them around, but you can check the resistance between the positive and the negative, and it should be around 0.5 ohms of resistance. That's how you know the coil is in half functioning order. And then you could check between the resistance from the high voltage part and the positive. So this should be a really high number, I think like 6,000 ohms. Yeah, as you can see here, 5.8 kilo ohms, so we're at about 5,800 ohms. So that will tell us that the coil itself is all good. The resistance, I hate checking resistance. Multimeters usually suck and they don't actually do a good job of it. So that tells us though that our coil is seemingly all good. It's just the wiring, and we see that firsthand. This terminal is not even tight. So forget all this MSD garbage. Let's go back to the factory harness here, and let's just hook it back up, and we should have a car that starts. Oh, let's turn the ignition off before I somehow accidentally zap myself or something stupid like that. Positive is back on. Okay, stock wiring's back intact. Tower on. This is all hooked up. All right, well, here goes nothing. Well, that brings us back to a point I didn't think we were gonna have to go into. So that's a good thing, because we're getting deeper in this video. But I went back and checked for spark again, confirmed, still no spark straight from the coil. So now we're gonna go through and we're gonna add in a couple more tests here. We are going to check the OBC relay, which is under the dashboard and is responsible for transmitting your spark start signal to the ECU. So to test that, we want to come back over here to our main relay. First off, you want to make sure 30 has 12 volts, and it always will. So 30, ground, 12 volts. It should be 12 volts, engine on, engine off, doesn't matter. Or ignition on, ignition off. It should always be hot. Now we're going to check for voltage at pin 86. Now this is where the voltage comes from the OBC. So the OBC transmits it when you go to start the car. So with the ignition on, 86 should have 12 volts. Let's see which one's 86. Yep, battery voltage. All right, so that means our OBC is working. 30 and 86 both have 12 volts. So that basically confirms our OBC is working, which now could lead us down the road of maybe the main relay's bad. If it's getting fuel, I kind of doubt it, but the easiest thing to do here is just have a spare main relay. I know not everyone might have that, but testing the main relay is kind of a bunch of steps that are kind of annoying. Spare main relay, go ahead and pop it in. You can immediately hear it click. I think I forgot that the ignition's on, which actually I don't think this one clicks. Okay, that one does click. So I think our main relay is fine. Like I said, I'm pretty sure if we're getting fuel, that's not our problem. I'm kind of backtracking here because I wasn't expecting this to have problems like this, but still nothing. But we know our OBC is good. We know our fuel pump's good. We know our ignition coil is good. So that's kind of bringing us back here to the old crank position sensors. We're getting towards the end of what's feasible. Now our next step here is the speed and the reference sensor, the two crank sensors. Now this is a little more confusing, but we're gonna give it a shot. So with your multimeter set to AC voltage mode, we have back probed the black one, which I think is the speed, either one, whatever. It's one or the other. Now the value for this should be 4 volts when it's back probed while cranking. So if you guys look at the meter right here, while we crank this over, it should be 4 volts. So we'll see. And we got our main relay and our fuel pump relay off. Okay, 1.6 volts. So that's technically bad. That's not, it should not be, should be higher than that. So that immediately is telling me that this sensor might be bad. And I believe this one is only 0.4. Yeah, I think that one's actually good. I mean, it was a little, it kind of fluctuated. It was a little under, then it went a little over. All right, well, that tells us that one of these I think is good and one is bad. Now, I keep spare crank sensors. If you don't have them, now at this point in time, once you're here, you're kind of gonna need to buy them because we've eliminated a lot of the things that this could be. If we have power at the ignition coil, power at the main relay, power at pin 86, then we're pretty much looking at a system that's all working except for one thing or two things, those crank sensors. So my spare crank sensor collection is bottom of the barrel. Most of these have broken connectors, but we'll try anyway. So car's up in the air and you can see there is your crank sensors. So one and the other one, not sure which is which, but we're gonna go in there and we're gonna replace one and then probably both. So we'll start with one, see if it changed anything. If it runs, then we know we did the right one. If not, then we will just do both. Got it. Sensor itself looks fine, it's clean, but you never know how these fail. So no dice with the other sensor, but I went to replace the lower one, and it came out in 2 pieces. Now, either this was just really seized in there, or we have a totally messed up sensor. So this could be our culprit. Getting this out was absolutely awful, and it wasn't fun. But we got it out. Now we're going to swap in another sensor, and let's see if we have a car again. Both crank sensors are now replaced. Let's see what we got. Oh! Oh! Oh yeah. Come to life, baby. First start in over a decade. You wouldn't even know that this thing, you wouldn't even know it was out of commission. It fired right up. I mean, I guess I've been building fuel pressure, cranking it over and over again. But even then, wow. Wow, this thing runs like a cherry. Oh, dust. I'm actually amazed right now at how nice this car runs. 10 years and it runs like a top. There is some good systematic troubleshooting. I'm actually pretty surprised it ended up being the crank sensors. I didn't think it would get to that point. However, this is just yet another example of it's always the crank sensor. I mean, seriously, crank no start symptoms on E24, E30, E34. It seems to me like 90% of the time it's crank position sensors. It's like insane. It's just, I mean, you should always have spares on you. It'll save you a lot of trouble. Of course, you want to go through and do the troubleshooting rather than throw parts at it, and I hope this helped, but yeah, man, this thing, she's running beautifully. Let's see if a decade of sitting healed this auto trans or not. Man, this thing runs good. Oh, windows work great. Well, the driver one does. Okay, so we got reverse. Oh yeah, he wasn't kidding. It won't even. Yeah, it's got 4 neutrals. That transmission is done for, but that engine is healthy as can be. Man, it really sucks. I really was hoping to experience an M30 with a camshaft, but I guess this isn't the one. Well, that sucks. First time back alive in 12 years. Running like an absolute champ. I mean, not even skipping a beat. No major service needed. Literally troubleshooting a crank sensor, some gas, and she's happy as can be. Just goes to show you how amazing these cars are. I mean, how durable they are, how resilient they are. 12 years. You would think that this car has been daily driven for the past however long, because there is no issues with the engine. Trans, yes, but engine is beautiful, runs great. I'm stoked on that. So that was my troubleshooting diagnostic kind of path right there. That's how I go about it. Sometimes I just throw crank sensors at cars. This time around, I really wanted to go through and make sure that it wasn't something else, because I knew there was that weird MSD and I knew that things were kind of touched. In that case, you need to kind of start from scratch, and that's how I go about it. So yet another crank sensor failure. After sitting for 10 years, it's kind of expected. But yeah, I hope this video taught you guys some things. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope it gave you some confidence in tackling the next non-running car that you come across, whether it be your car one day not starting or a car that you want to buy. I hope this gave you some confidence to dive into those and not be super worried. At the end of the day, they're 80s cars. They're not really that complex. As long as you go through the steps systematically, you'll figure it out. The only special tool you really need is a multimeter. That did come in handy here. Sometimes you can get away without it, but this time around we did need it. So yeah, simple as that. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.